In the heart of ancient Rome's grand forum, Emperor Nero appears hand in hand with a dazzling woman draped in silks and jewels. But behind the envious stares and polite congratulations, there are whispers, cold, unsettling whispers. Because everyone knows the horrifying truth, the emperor's new bride was once a boy named Sporus. And what Nero did to him remains one of the most disturbing acts of psychological and physical cruelty in human history. Before we dive into this story of survival obsession and suffering, if you love uncovering the hidden, forbidden corners of history, the tales that chill your blood and stay with you long after the video ends, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's incredible that across thousands of years and half a world apart, we're able to sit together now, connected by the ghosts of the past. What you're about to hear is not just another tale of Roman excess. This is the story of how absolute power twisted love into obsession, grief into madness, and turned a living human being into a breathing doll, forced to exist only to serve one man's broken fantasy. The name Sporus may not be familiar to you now, but once you hear his story, you'll never forget it. 1,000 oil-soaked torches blazed in swirling pine resin smoke clung to the massive stone arches of the Golden Palace. The music thundered brass horns, skin drums, the crowd's roaring cheers, all merged into a resounding wave through the night. Amid that sea of light, the emperor of the world Nero stepped forward. His cloak, golden brocaded, trailed behind him. A crown of pearls and fiery feathers rested on his head. In his hand, he grasped a fragile, pale hand, trembling beneath layers of gold bracelets and jade rings. The woman, at least everyone had to call her that, stood beside him, eyes downcast, lips pressed together like a sewn wound. And Rome held its breath. No one in that hall dared stare too long. For everyone knew the whispered truth spreading like poison through the corridors. This was not an empress. This was Sporus, a youth who had been born male, now stripped, mutilated, buried alive within his own body, to serve as a substitute for a dead woman. But who would dare speak in Rome? A poorly timed whisper could bury your entire family under a guard's sword. So they all applauded, they cheered, they lifted goblets of wine while every heart ached with something both captivating and horrifying. The music shifted into a wedding rhythm. Nero leaned down, gripping his bride's hand so tightly as if releasing it would make that phantom vanish. His face glowed almost delirious. They said he had never looked so happy or so detached from reality. When the priest began, when the ancient rites echoed, all of Rome watched, uncertain whether they were witnessing a wedding or a soul summoning. The scent of burning pine resin mingled with the fragrance in Sporus's perfumed hair, scented with Arabian essences. Roses were strewn across the floor, though in torchlight they resembled bloodstains. Gold-embroidered brocaded curtains fluttered in the draft like funeral veils. Everything merged into a scene both splendid and grotesque. They still called Rome the city of the gods, but that night it seemed more like a living graveyard where love had been dug from a corpse and dressed upon a body still breathing. No one said it aloud, but in many eyes this was a sacrifice. A flesh and blood human turned into an idol forced to live as a distorted echo of someone dead. Every smile Sporus had to paint onto his lips was a blade carving away his identity. Every step in that heavy silk gown felt like his body betraying his soul. And as Nero pressed a kiss to his forehead, like a groom to his bride in the watchers' hearts, a shiver traveled like disease. A few drunken voices laughed, but the laughter was swallowed immediately, strangled in throats. Many turned their faces, terrified that their eyes might betray the truth. Yet others stared, unable to look away, for the spectacle held a witch-like pull, like standing on the edge of an abyss. You fear it, yet cannot help leaning closer. The wedding continued in solemn tradition. They held hands, cut the wedding cake, shared the sacred wine. Every gesture was perfect, as if Nero was trying to rewrite memory, replacing death with ceremony, guilt with performance. In that moment, Sporus ceased to be himself. He became a living mirror, reflecting the image of someone murdered by the very hands embracing him. The palace echoed with music, but amid the drum beats and flutes, those who listened closely heard another sound, the silence. Silence heavy as the dust upon a tomb. The silence of hundreds pretending, swallowing the truth to survive. Sporus' own silence, his eyes empty, as if his soul had been driven out of his body. That night, Rome stayed awake. No one could forget that image, the emperor marrying a shadow that breathes, trembles, cries in silence. People went to sleep with the scent of pine resin lingering in their hair. The torchlight still burned in their eyes, and the question rising like a nightmare, was this still love? Or just Nero hiding a corpse under a silk gown? Perhaps the most terrifying thing was not what Nero did to Sporus, but that an entire empire clapped in approval. The wedding ended in shouts of praise, but who knows how many hearts pounded in those hidden chambers of Rome, how many hands trembled, how many dreams turned into nightmares that night. And you, if you were sitting in that hall, raising your cup to toast a perverse love, what would you do? Would you cheer, applaud, bow your head? Or would you dare look straight into Sporus's hollow eyes, the eyes reflecting a question never voiced? Is it possible that loving someone is the quickest way to kill them? In the beginning, Nero was not a monster. At just 16 years old, when he ascended to the throne, people believed the young boy would usher in a golden era. But Rome would learn a cruel truth: absolute power is like poison. It does not kill instantly, but seeps in slowly, day by day, until the heart turns thick and black. And the death of one woman was the final drop that spilled the cup of blood in his mind. Her name was Poppaea, a woman so beautiful that even her enemies had to admit it, so intelligent that even her quietest words could shift the political game board. When Nero first saw Poppaea, he was already married to Octavia, a gentle, silent princess, like a shadow placed beside the throne. Octavia stirred no storms, but it was that very silence that made her feel like a gray, lifeless wall. Poppaea was different. She was fire. She was laughter power dressed in beauty's skin. Nero loved her to the point of madness. No, it was not love. It was an addiction, a fever that refused to break. He cast Octavia aside, defying the law, tradition, and even Rome itself. The wedding of Nero and Poppaea was a lavish spectacle, bursting with gemstone rings, roses, and vows echoing through the palace. But only those close enough could see a more dangerous thing growing in Nero's eyes: the hunger for total possession. He locked Poppaea inside his obsession. Anyone who stared at her too long died. Anyone who whispered her name trembled. He drowned her in gold and silk, but behind it all was one truth. Nero did not want a wife, he wanted a possession. Poppaea knew, and perhaps it was her brilliance that became her curse. She used Nero's love to build power for her family, to claim her place, to survive in a world where one wrong glance could cost a head. But that same intelligence made her bold enough to say things no one else dared. When the court fell silent before Nero's mistakes, Poppaea laughed and mocked. When Nero obsessed over the stage, she dared to call him a mediocre actor. And one day, she made her gravest mistake, reminding Nero he had forgotten what it meant to be a husband, a father. That night, Rome witnessed the tragedy of twisted love. A rage erupted, a kick, or perhaps a flurry of blows. Historians argue the details, but all agree on the outcome. Poppaea, carrying a child within her, collapsed onto the cold marble floor, blood blooming like flowers across the stone. Nero, the emperor of 60 million souls, had killed the only woman he truly wanted to keep. That moment may have been when Nero's mind shattered completely. He threw himself beside her, cradling her cooling body, weeping, begging, then screaming orders for her to come back to life. The finest doctors in Rome were dragged in trembling as they bowed before an impossible command. No one could save Poppaea. She drew her final breath, leaving behind an empire suffocating in silence. But Nero would not let her go. He refused cremation. He refused release. He had her body embalmed, placed in a tomb more magnificent than any emperor's. He deified her, forcing the court to speak of her in the present tense as if death were merely rumor. At banquets, her chair remained empty, wine still poured, courtier smiles still aimed toward a void. Picture it a feast filled with music, rivers of wine rose petals underfoot. In the center, an empty chair draped in white silk. No one dared sit, no one dared touch. And everyone had to speak, as if Poppaea still sat there laughing, listening. Anyone careless enough to use the past tense saying she was, instead of she is, would be exiled or vanish by nightfall. By lamplight, amid music and forced laughter, that empty chair resembled an open casket. People drank, smiled, kissed hands, while beside them, death sat, displayed like an honored guest. And at the head of the table, Nero stared into the emptiness, smiling, whispering, as if the dead woman still whispered back. This was not merely the tragedy of a love gone wrong. It was the beginning of a collective delusion, an entire empire forced to pretend together. And then in one moment, Nero turned and saw another face. A younger face, tender, unformed, but with eyes that mirrored Poppaea's exactly. A face that would open the door to a new nightmare. And from the empty chair, a question echoed, haunting. When someone dies, what is more terrifying, to lose them forever, or to be forced to live forever with their shadow? During the days when Nero was still drowning in a funeral that never ended, the imperial court lived alongside a ghost. People dined with an empty chair, pouring wine for someone who now lay beneath cold stone. But an empire cannot live in the past forever. And then, in what seemed like an accidental moment, a face stepped into the gaze of a madman. That face was not meant to be there. It was not supposed to exist in that moment. But it did. And destiny instantly shifted course. Sporus, a slender teenager, had just been freed from a life of palace servitude. He was not a prince, not a noble, merely one child among thousands of nameless faces drifting through the marble halls of the palace. He had learned to read, to write, to handle ledgers, trained to become an educated servant, the kind Rome found useful, but never allowed to meet their master's eyes. Sporus never believed he had a destiny, but destiny had seen him. The first time Nero looked upon that face, he forgot to breathe. Those eyes, that cheekbone structure, something in that fragile architecture, as if Poppaea had been born anew. No one else noticed the resemblance as sharply as he did, because in his mind, Poppaea had never truly left. When Nero looked at Sporus, he did not see a boy. He saw the woman he had killed with his own hands. In that instant, the boundaries collapsed between life and death, man and woman, real and unreal. Nero did not ask. He decided, and when an emperor decides, it is no longer a decision, it becomes the law of the universe. It is said Nero whispered, "Poppaea. She has returned." No one dared correct him. The courtiers bowed, swallowing their shudders, because they knew from that moment on, Sporus was locked inside an invisible cage. Not one made of chains, but of obsession, the emperor's gaze. From that day forward, Sporus was pulled from his ordinary life. No more ledgers, no more simple duties. Instead came the stares, the whispers, the pitying or horrified eyes. Sporus did not understand why. But soon he began to notice strange things: guards posted outside his door, women's dresses delivered to his chambers, servant girls with trembling hands, bringing makeup while stealing panicked glances. He looked into the mirror, and for the first time was afraid of his own face. In Rome, people believed appearance was more than surface, it was soul. To resemble someone in the face meant to share their fate, and now that face had become a curse. It made Nero believe destiny had returned Poppaea to him, inside the body of a boy. Nero, the man who had once spoken to a corpse, could no longer tell dream from reality. He believed he had been forgiven. He believed love could be resurrected. But for Sporus, it was the beginning of a nightmare with no escape. A person cannot outrun their own face. Each time he looked in the mirror, he saw the shadow of a woman he had never met yet, who now lived through him. Each time Nero called him Sabina Poppaea's name, he felt a layer of his own skin stripped away, replaced with someone else's memory. On those nights, Rome still held banquets, still poured wine for the empty chair. But Nero no longer stared into the void. He stared at Sporus. And from that gaze, a horrifying plan began to form. If destiny returned Poppaea in the form of a boy, then Nero would reshape that body-cut break and destroy it until it matched his delusion. Sporus did not yet understand, but the court did. They had seen Nero's ruthlessness when it came to bending reality to his will. And a dream in the hands of an all-powerful man is no longer a dream, it becomes a death sentence for anyone caught in its path. Rumors began to spread in the shadows, that Nero would not stop at dressing Sporus in gowns, that there would be scalpels, there would be blood, there would be the hands of physicians forcing the body to change, that Sporus would no longer be a boy, but would never truly become a girl either. He would be a living puppet, a doll wearing the wrong face in the wrong time. In the palace, when the music faded and the oil lamps dimmed, Rome slept. But in a small chamber, Sporus lay awake, staring at the shadow cast on his wall. And he understood, starting today, that shadow would never fully belong to him again. And the haunting question whispered like a knock at an invisible door: if one day your face no longer belongs to you, but becomes the property of someone else, do you still exist? Within the cold stone walls of the palace, there was a room prepared for a ritual that never should have existed. It was not a medical room, nor a sacred chamber. It resembled a torture chamber more than anything else, though it wore the disguise of a wedding suite. Sheer silk curtains hung in the air to hide the blood that would soon splatter. Scented oils burned to mask the stench of scorched flesh, and trembling oil lamps cast dim golden light upon blades glinting with cold steel. They called it healing, but in truth, it was simply a murder carried out slowly, a death of the self. Sporus was led inside his hands, unbound, yet heavy as stone. Guards flanked him, their eyes turned away, as if they themselves were guilty. He looked around and saw a wooden table covered in white cloth. That white was no symbol of purity. It was a burial shroud waiting to be soaked in blood. And in that moment, he understood he would never walk out the same person who had walked in. The physicians summoned did not dare meet his gaze. They only bowed their heads, trembling, fully aware that every cut they made was both an act of obedience and a sentence. A few sighed quietly, but no one resisted. In Rome, a single refusal could mean the erasure of your entire bloodline. They picked up the blades, the clamps, the red-hot irons, and began their work. Screams rang out, slammed into the walls, echoed back, and repeated until they no longer sounded human, but more like an animal being butchered. He was held down, his body, writhing sweat mingling with blood running in long streaks across the white sheet. The stench of hot iron against flesh, the acrid burn of singed skin filled the air. The ceiling swayed above him, trembling like it might collapse. In that moment, Sporus understood that death does not always mean the end of breath. Some deaths are slow, where the body is carved away piece by piece until the soul no longer recognizes what it inhabits. He felt each slice like a command to erase memory, erase the future, erase any chance to live as a man. Nero was not present, but his absence was heavier than any presence. It was whispered that he could not bear to hear the screams, yet demanded a detailed report of every incision, every cut. Because in his mind, Poppaea was returning. In his mind, this was not destruction, it was resurrection. When the final blade was set down, the room fell so silent you could hear the blood dripping onto the stone floor. Sporus lay motionless, his body covered in sweat, and blood, his eyes wide open, as if forced to stare directly into the truth. A cruel truth, he was still breathing, but the person who once lived in that body had been killed. In the days that followed, his body trembled with fever, his wounds oozed each breath, slicing deeper into his chest. But the worst pain was not in the flesh. It came when he was brought before a large mirror in a room decorated with dried roses and silk scarves. They wanted him to see. They wanted him to witness the transformation. But the reflection staring back was a stranger, a creature that was no longer male but could never truly be female. A body being molded into a wax figure for a ghost. From then on, every day of Sporus began with covering his wounds in soft silk, painting pale lips, with a touch of pink brushing black powder onto his eyelids, to make his gaze resemble Poppaea's. Each layer of rouge, each curl of hair was a declaration his former self had been replaced. No one saw Sporus anymore. They only saw Poppaea. But the most haunting part lay not in the garments, but in the memories he was forced to wear. Nero began calling him by a new name, Sabina, and expected him to respond as if that truly were his own. Nero retold stories once shared with Poppaea, and waited for Sporus to nod, to smile, to reply. Each word spoken was another stab into the soul he was made to recite memories that were not his own, to accept experiences he had never lived. It was another kind of surgery, one without scalpels, but far more cruel, cutting into the mind, to replace it with borrowed memories. At night, while Rome slept, Sporus lay still, listening to the wind howl through the corridors, still sensing the scent of pine resin from Poppaea's funeral, lingering nearby. He touched his wounds, felt the trembling beat of his heart, and wondered, was he still alive, or merely a corpse forced to move? Perhaps the surgery had not only severed his body, it had cut away his right to be himself. It turned a person into a mirror for someone else to gaze into, a shadow shaped to fill the emptiness of a broken heart. And in the end, a question echoed like a voice from a wound that never healed. Perhaps the worst pain is not losing your life, but losing the right to exist as yourself. The morning did not begin with birdsong or sunlight spilling through a window. It began with the sound of a door opening. The handmaidens entered like ghosts, carrying combs, powders, rouge, and scraps of silk gleaming like snakeskin. They said little. They simply worked. Sporus's hair was pulled, twisted, curled into elaborate coils, the very style Poppaea had once worn. Each time the comb scraped against his scalp, he felt as though his skin was being peeled away layer by layer to make room for another face. Then came the paint. Crushed charcoal mixed with oil was smeared across his eyelids to make his eyes appear larger, more enchanting, more like the gaze of a dead woman. A touch of red on the lips, a hint of blush on the cheeks. Sporus looked into the mirror and saw a stranger's face. But the most haunting thing was not the makeup. It was the way the servants avoided his gaze. They looked into the mirror instead of at him, as if they too were forced to believe that Sporus no longer existed, that a ghost had returned. The garments were draped over him. Smooth silk from the east, heavy as chains, clung to a body that had been surgically altered and now moved awkwardly, sluggishly. Every step had to be relearned: how to place the feet, how to let the hands rest, how far to tilt the head to appear more feminine. Even how to sit had to be taught, not like a boy who once read books in the library, but like an empress seated before the court. But the worst horrors were not in the body. They were in the mind. Nero hired people to teach Sporus how to speak like Poppaea, how to react like Poppaea. The stories she used to tell the anecdotes she once shared were now scripts for Sporus to memorize. Nero repeated memories, travels, conversations long gone, and waited for Sporus to nod, to smile, to agree, as if he had been there. Every lie became another false memory hammered into his mind. Sporus began to wonder which memories were real and which were not. When you are forced to repeat stories that never belonged to you, one day you begin to believe they are true. And that is more terrifying than death because it steals not just the present, but the past as well. At banquets, Nero sat beside him, gripping his hand tightly, calling him Sabina, with a burning gaze. The crowd watched, clapped, cheered, raised their goblets. No one dared speak the truth, but everyone knew in front of them was no queen, only a breathing doll. And that doll had to smile, had to nod, had to raise the wine while inside the self was being carved down to bare bone. Sporus's bedchamber was decorated with objects once owned by Poppaea. A massive mirror, a jade hairpin, bottles of perfume long emptied. Each night he lay in that room looking around and feeling like he was sleeping in someone else's tomb. Each morning he awoke to be pulled once again into an endless rehearsal where the only role was the shadow of a dead woman. There were moments when Sporus whispered his real name, just to remember he had once existed. But each time the sound echoed hollow in a room filled with the scent of pine resin, and he feared even he no longer believed in that name. Nero, meanwhile, was happy. He walked through the gardens with his new queen, flaunting her to the crowds, gripping Sporus's hand like a man who had conquered fate. In his eyes, this was the ultimate triumph of power, not only ruling an empire, but ruling over truth itself. He could kill and then bring back to life his way. But for Sporus, each day was a slow death. He looked in the mirror and no longer saw his own face, only a mask painted by another's hand. And the most horrifying part was that the mirror began to betray him. After months, the false memories began to bleed into his thoughts. He found himself dreaming of things that never happened, dreaming he had once been, Poppaea had once loved. Nero had once laughed upon the throne. When dreams and waking life merge, where does the self begin? With each passing day, Sporus became more like a character in a play with no final act. The problem was, this play had no free audience. The audience, Rome's entire court, was forced to applaud. And when everyone claps, the line between real and false disappears. Perhaps that was the most terrifying torture, not the scalpels, not the powder and paint, but the truth twisted so far that even the victim began to doubt himself. Sporus no longer knew who he was. A boy who once had a name, a false queen with borrowed memories, or a doll that could smile and cry but no longer had a soul. That question echoed every time his trembling fingers touched the mirror's cold surface. If one day you look into the mirror and someone else looks back, are you still you? Nero's wedding night was no wedding. It was more like a grotesque performance, a magical ritual, a spiritual experiment wearing the mask of a sacred ceremony. The palace turned into a temple of light. Thousands of red torches burned, casting their glow on rose petals soaked in perfume, both sweet and pungent, like a corpse embalmed in fragrance. The crowd pressed in nobles in purple robes, officials gilded in gold guards, standing like statues. They came to witness, but no one dared admit that what they were about to see was a wedding between the living and a ghost. The music began. Drums, flutes, and brass horns stretched into the air like a summons from another world. And then Nero appeared, still moving like a man who believed himself divine, his eyes glowing in the firelight, his hand gripping the trembling hand of Sporus. But Sporus no longer had his real name. In front of the crowd, Nero called him by another Sabina, the name of Poppaea. It was not a term of endearment. It was a decree, a sentence. The hall fell silent. Everyone knew they were supposed to applaud, to cheer, but in that moment all they could hear was the sound of their own heartbeat. Because what stood before them was a violation of reality. A young boy still bearing the softness of youth, now clad in a pure white wedding gown, a veil of silk covering his head eyes, painted black, to appear larger cheeks, painted red in theatrical blush. He was led forward like a doll, each step uncertain, each breath out of place. The ceremony began. The priest read blessings for marriage, but even he trembled, eyes cast downward, voice faltering. No one in the room believed this was a marriage, but who would dare deny it with Nero standing there, arm raised, high eyes, blazing like a man who had mastered both death and life. They held hands before the altar. Nero spoke his vows, but they were not the vows of a groom to a bride. They were the ramblings of a madman to a shadow, that his love would overcome death, that nothing could separate them, that the dead woman had returned. He placed the ring on Sporus's hand, not to unite but to seal the substitution. A name buried, a self erased. Sporus said nothing. He could not. He dared not. He simply nodded, lips pressed tight as if silence itself was the only way to survive. But in his eyes a flash passed through, a glimpse of terror mixed with the realization that from this day forward, every remaining moment of his life would be a play that never ended. The crowd applauded. The applause was uneven, trembling, like a song played out of tune. But Nero did not care. In his ears, it was the sound of adoration, the cheers of an empire, the confirmation that death could be undone, that memory could wear new flesh. He smiled a radiant, terrifying smile and kissed Sporus on the forehead. They saw his lips touch the white powder, leaving behind a smudged mark. And in that moment, many felt as if they had witnessed a dark ritual, a death called back to life, a spirit trapped inside a breathing body. Some later whispered they heard Poppaea's voice in the wind, that her scent passed through the room when Nero kissed Sporus. But perhaps that was just their minds fracturing under the strain of being forced to believe the impossible. The wedding feast that followed was resplendent. Wine flowed like rivers. Music thundered like storms. But at the center, beneath the fake laughter and clinking goblets, Sporus sat like a jeweled puppet, forced to smile, to nod, to greet the guests. Each smile he drew was a fresh wound. Each congratulation received was an invisible cut. And each gaze cast upon him was a reminder Sporus was dead. Only Sabina remained a shadow dressed in white. That night, as Rome sank into slumber, all carried that image in their minds. A wedding no one dared name a bride, who was not a bride, a groom who was not a lover, but a murderer. They slept in the scent of pine resin, in the glow of torches, still burned into their eyes, and in the nightmare that love could become a dark magic devouring both truth and soul. And the question remained echoing like a voice from a crypt: if a vow is spoken in falsehood, yet all are forced to believe, does that vow become real? Each morning, Sporus opened his eyes in a room that had never belonged to him. The walls were adorned with portraits of Poppaea, with jewelry that had once touched her skin, with broken perfume bottles, still holding a lingering scent, sweet yet sharp, like something spoiled beneath a veil of sweetness. He did not awaken as a person, but as someone stepping out of a recurring dream. Because the moment his eyes opened, someone would call him not by his real name, but by Sabina. That name was not affection. It was a command. A sentence that forced the soul to evacuate the body, making space for a role. His day began like a stage play. Servants brought dresses, powders, combs. They did not ask questions. They did not dare look him in the eye. They simply worked like puppets on strings. And when the tall mirror was wheeled in, Sporus would sit before it and see someone else looking back. Skin, powdered white lips, red like congealed blood eyes, painted deep black to appear larger. A counterfeit Poppaea, a memory embodied. And he was forced to believe that this reflection was himself. At the banquets, Nero led him before the court. He called Sporus in a sweet tone as if summoning back his wife. He recounted memories, their journey to Naples, the evening performance in the theater, the lavish seaside feasts. But those were not Sporus's memories. They belonged to someone dead. And still he had to nod, had to smile, had to reply as if he had truly lived through those days. At first, Sporus was only acting, but with time the line between real and false began to fracture. When you repeat memories that are not yours, when you recount them as if they were lived one day, you begin to dream them. And in those dreams, Sporus found himself standing by the sea, hearing the waves, laughing with Nero, things that had never happened, yet appeared so vividly they terrified him. He began to wonder, if I remember something that never happened, does it become real in my mind? And as the false memories pushed their way in, the true ones receded. Who had he been? A nameless boy in the palace. A child who once had dreams of his own, or only Poppaea an immortal role in Nero's endless play. Nero became more and more devoted to the illusion. He called Sporus my queen before the court, demanding all to bow as they would to a true empress. No one dared object. And when everyone bowed, the lie became reality. Rome had become a grand stage where every person was an unwilling actor in a play written by a madman. Sporus was the centerpiece of that lie. But for him, this was not performance, it was destruction. Because each passing day, he was forced to repeat memories that were never his, and slowly they began to overwrite the truth. He could no longer say for certain how he had lived before. Even when he whispered his own name in the darkness, it sounded foreign, like a ghost with no place left to haunt. Late at night, after the palace lights had dimmed, Sporus sat before the mirror, trembling fingers touching the cold glass. In the reflection, there was no boy, but a woman reconstructed. He wanted to cry, but the tear that fell only made the reflection resemble Poppaea, more the woman who had once wept before she died. And he understood even his pain no longer belonged to him. It had been taken. It had become a prop in Nero's deranged play. At times, Sporus thought of death, for only in death he believed would the memories stop. Only in death could he preserve something that was still his. But then came the fear. If he died, would anyone remember him? Or would history remember only Sabina, the ghost Nero had created? Perhaps death was not liberation, but simply another curtain falling over the self. During parades, Nero led Sporus before the people, presenting him as a queen. Cheers erupted, but beneath the noise was revulsion, a quiet horror. The people saw the falsehood clearly, but no one dared speak. They clapped. And when all clap together, the lie becomes truth. Rome was complicit. Perhaps that was the greatest tragedy, not that Nero had killed Sporus's identity, but that the entire empire had helped bury it. A person turned into someone else's memory, while millions applauded and pretended it was real. At night, in a room thick with the scent of faded perfumes, Sporus looked into the mirror once more. And the old question returned, carving through his mind like a blade. If one day your real memories disappear, replaced by someone else's, do you still exist? Nero was dead. The empire that once trembled at his singing and his madness now had a new master. But when a monster falls, the successors often gather the shards of that madness to play their own games of power. And Sporus, the child once turned into a ghost queen, was not freed. He simply became a trophy, a possession passed from hand to hand in the great political chessboard. After Nero's death, Sporus was seized as one might seize a rare treasure. A general claimed him, then a government official, then a new emperor. All of them did the same thing. They forced him into dresses, forced him to live again as the resurrected Poppea. It was as if Sporus had lost the right to be human. He had become a symbol, an ornament, a form of entertainment. A grotesque reminder that Rome once had an emperor who dared to marry a shadow. And then came Vitellius, and he wanted more. Vitellius did not want Sporus as a queen. He wanted to make him into a public spectacle. Stories spread that he planned to throw Sporus into the arena to reenact Greek myths, Persephone dragged into the underworld, Eurydice never allowed to return, women humiliated before tens of thousands of spectators. But this time, the woman would be Sporus, not myth, but a teenager stripped of identity, remade for amusement. The rumors spread, and Sporus understood there were no more roles left to hide in, no more gowns to shield himself, no more false memories to inhabit. In front of him lay only two paths: be thrown to the crowd and suffer humiliation beyond measure, or write his own ending. That night, the room was silent as a tomb. Sporus sat before the mirror, where he had seen hundreds of faces that were not his. This time he stared longer. The powder had faded. The lipstick had dulled. Beneath the mask was a face gaunt, pale, hollow. Not Poppea. No longer Sabina. Not even Sporus as he had once been. Just a shadow hollow inside. And in that emptiness, a thought emerged. Perhaps death would be the first time he was truly free. No one knows exactly how he prepared. Some said he drank poison. Others claimed he used a small blade. All that is certain is that before he could be dragged into the arena, Sporus chose his own ending. There were no cheers, no spectators, no ghost wedding, no empty chair left for a spirit. Only a body collapsing in silence. A single choice that no emperor could take away. Sporus's death was not a minor footnote in the history of Rome. It was a chilling proof that some people are buried alive while still breathing, stripped of identity, until the only way to declare I exist is to die. Death became a declaration. Death became resistance. Later, historians retold Sporus's story as a cautionary tale about Nero's depravity, about the empire's descent into madness. But they missed one truth: Sporus was not just a symbol, not just a victim in the tragic comedy of power. He was a person, a human being forced to become someone else's memory, forced to live inside the shadow of a dead woman. And in the end, he chose the one thing still truly his death. In the silence of that night, one question echoed, cutting across 2,000 years of history. If you are stripped of the right to be yourself, Is death the only way to truly exist? And perhaps that is the deepest horror. Not Nero, not Rome, but the truth that even in today's world, there are still so many Sporus people forced to live inside someone else's memory, to hide their souls behind painted masks, to smile while feeling utterly hollow inside. 2,000 years have passed, and we still have no answer to that question.